As you get into more complex applications, you'll need to pass data between activities, sending data to one activity, receiving it in that activity, and then returning data to the calling activity. You do this with intent extras, bits of data that you add to the intent before you start a new activity or finish the current one. I'll describe how to do this in the project Intent Extras. In this version of my project, I've switched my layouts around a bit. My main activity is now just an empty linear layout, and it has an ID of layout that will let me add items to it at runtime. The activity detail now has the two text views and the image view, but the layout doesn't have any data attached. Previously, these showed actual text and an actual image. I've also added some images to this version of the application. In addition to my original flower image, I have two others, California Snow and Haight-Ashbury, and these images and their associated string values are now in a class called Flower Data. This class produces a list of flower objects, and this is where all the data is coming from. This data class is loosely modeled on the dummy data class that you get when you generate a fragments application. Finally, there's a flower class, and this represents a single instance of a flower. Each flower has a string for the flower name, an integer for the image resource pointing to one of those images, and a string for the instructions. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to dynamically generate 3 buttons, one for each item in the flowers list. This code is getting the list from the flower data class, and this code is getting the reference to the linear layout that's at the root of the current activities layout. At the bottom of all that code, I'll type for each and press Control Space and select a for each code template. On each time through this loop, I'll be referring to one instance of the flower class. I'm going to be going down to an anonymous inner class, so to refer to this, I'll need to make this final. Now within the loop, I'll create a button. I'll declare the data type and make sure I've imported it, name it button, and instantiate it with the constructor method and pass in the current context. Next, I'll set the button's label with button.setText, and I'll pass in the flower name of the flower. That's a property of the flower class. And then I'll add this button to the layout with layout.addView, and I'll pass in the button object. I'll get rid of this suppress warnings annotation. It's not needed anymore. I'll save my changes and run the app. The main activity started off as completely blank, but now when the app comes to the screen, it'll display the 3 buttons, one for each flower. My next step is to add some code that will be executed when each button is clicked. I'll go back to my code and add some more code within the for loop. I'll add an event listener with button.setOnClickListener, and I'll pass in a new instance of view.onClickListener. This is exactly the same strategy I used previously in working with a single button. I'll be sure to add this semicolon at the end to complete the statement. And then I'll add some code to the onClick method. Now my goal is to pass all 3 values that are associated with the flower object to the receiving activity. Each of those will be what we call an extra. An extra is a key value pair. The key is always a string, but the value can be a string, an integer, a floating value, or a few other data types. To pass in an extra value, first you need an intent. So I'll create a new intent object, and I'll instantiate it with new intent, and for the context, I'll pass in the current instance of the current activity with main activity.this. And I'll pass in the class of the activity I want to go to, detailActivity.class. And now I'm ready to pass in my extra values. For each value, I'll call a method called intent.putExtra. Notice all the data types that you can pass in: booleans, bytes, characters, doubles, strings, and so on. I'll pass in a name of flower name and a value that comes from the flower object, flower.flowerName. Now, I'll copy and paste that bit of code a couple of times, And then I'll set the keys and the values for the other two extras. The next one will be image resource. And this will be the integer value of the image resource field of the flower object. It'll look like this: flower.imageResource. And finally, I'll pass in the instructions. And that'll be the string value, flower.instructions. So now my intent is complete, and I've added the extra data to it, and I'm ready to launch that activity. So, as I've done previously, I'll call start activity, and I'll pass in the intent object. I'll save and run the code. Now when I click each of the buttons, I jump to that secondary activity, but I'm not seeing anything yet, because I haven't received the data and passed it to the widgets that are a part of this layout. But I'll show you how to do that in the next movie.